Hi, welcome to Educational Job Guide YouTube channel. In this video, we are going to see the permanent assistant professor, associate professor and professor vacancies from one of the government university. It will be the wonderful opportunity to the candidates who are looking for this type of opportunity. So please share this video with your friends and colleagues. So to get my next video on notification, subscribe the channel and then tap the all bell icon and watch this video until the end to get the complete details regarding this multiple discipline or subject recruitment notification from this government university. And now while coming to the present content of this video, so it is the official website of this university. So you can check down here University of Jammu. It is official website. If you enter into this website, you may check down here scrolling new jobs teaching JU. If you click on this one, you will see this type of interface, teaching staff, then click first advertisement. So if you click on this one and then it will be directed to this recruitment notifications. So here the official recruitment notification is given. So let's check about which departments are having the which subject notification. University of Jammu advertisement notice. Online applications complete in all respects all individual for the following posts so as to reach the undersigned on the before 10th July 2023. Here the department wise number of seat metrics and position are mentioned. First department is biotechnology. Associate professor for biotechnology, number of vacancy 1. Associate professor for microbiology, number of vacancy 1. Assistant professor for bioinformatics, number of vacancy 2. Now coming to the botany, professor, number of vacancy 1. Associate professor 2, assistant professor 1. Buddhist studies, associate professor 1, assistant professor 1. Center for history culture Jammu and Ladakh region, associate professor 1. Chemistry, professor 3, associate professor 3, assistant professor 2. Commerce, professor 2, associate professor 2, assistant professor 1. Computer science and IT, professor 1, associate professor 3. Directorate of Distance and Online Education, Director 1, Professor in Economics 1, Associate Professor in Economics 1, Assistant Professor in Urdu 1, Assistant Professor in Education 1, Assistant Professor in Law 1. Directorate of Hindi, Professor 1, Associate Professor 1, Assistant Professor 1. Department of Lifelong Learning, Professor 1, Associate Professor 1. Dogri, Professor 1, Associate Professor 1, Assistant Professor 1. Dhanvantri Librarian, Librarian 1, Deputy Librarian 2, Assistant Librarian 4. Economics, Professor 1, Associate Professor 2. Education, Professor 2, Associate Professor 2, Assistant Professor 1. Electronics, Associate Professor 1. English, Professor 2, Associate Professor 1. Environmental Science, Professor 1, Associate Professor 1, Assistant Professor 2. Geography, Professor 1, Associate Professor 1. Geology, Professor 3, Associate Professor 3, Assistant Professor 1. Hindi, Professor 2, Associate Professor 2, Assistant Professor 1. History, Professor 1, Associate Professor 3, Assistant Professor 2. IMFA, Assistant Professor 6. Journalism and Media Studies, Professor 1, Associate Professor 2, Assistant Professor 4. Law Department, Professor 3, Associate Professor 3. Library and Information Science, Associate Professor 1. Mathematics, Professor 3, Associate Professor 2, Assistant Professor 2. Physics, Professor 3, Associate Professor 3, Assistant Professor 2. Political Science, Professor 2, Assistant Professor 4. Psychology, Professor 1, Associate Professor 1, Assistant Professor 2. Philosophy, Professor 1, Associate Professor 2, Assistant Professor 4. Punjabi, Professor 1, Associate Professor 2. Remote Sensing and GIS, Assistant Professor 1. Sanskrit, Professor 1, Associate Professor 1, Assistant Professor 3. Sociology, Professor 1, Associate Professor 1, Assistant Professor 1. Statistics, Assistant Professor 1. Sports and Physical Education, Director 1, Assistant Director 1. Strategic and Religion Studies, Professor 1, Associate Professor 1. The Business School, Professor 3, Associate Professor 2. Urdu, Professor 1, associate professor 2, assistant professor 2. Geology professor 2, associate professor 3, assistant professor 1. Now coming to the offsite campus, here also department wise seat matrix and position are mentioned. First, Vadodara campus, associate professor for computer science 1, associate professor in English 1, associate professor in life science 1. Khatua campus, assistant professor MBA, number of post 1. Ponch campus, professor in Gojri and Pahari 1, assistant professor in Gojri and Pahari 2. Now coming to the professor and director pay matrix and academic level or eligibility criteria. Here the pay level are mentioned. Academic level 14 of 7 CPC, where the entry pay 1,44,200 rupees. Here the eligibility criteria are mentioned in detail. You may check down properly. Now coming to the librarian pay matrix, academic level and eligibility criteria. Here also mention the librarian pay matrix academic level 14 of 7 CPC, where entry pay 1,44,200 rupees. Here the eligibility criteria are mentioned in detail. You may check down properly. Now coming to the associate professor category. Here also mention academic pay level 13A of 7 CPC, where entry pay 1,31,400 rupees. Here the essential qualification are mentioned. You may check down properly. Now coming to the deputy librarian, academic level 13A of 7 CPC, where entry pay 1,31,400 rupees. Here eligibility criteria are mentioned in detail. You may check down properly. Now coming to the assistant professor category, academic level 10 of 7 CPC, where entry pay 57,700 rupees. Here the eligibility criteria are mentioned in detail. You may check down properly. Here also mention the assistant professor in remote sensing or GIS, assistant professor in higher into physics category, assistant librarian, assistant director. All details are mentioned here. You may check down properly with carefully. Now coming to the shortlisting criteria for assistant professor. Here the academic record and score are mentioned in detail. You may check down properly. Now coming to the shortlisting criteria for assistant librarian. Here also mention the academic record and score in detail. You may check down properly with carefully. Now coming to the general instruction. Here the application fees are mentioned. Now coming to the application fees. Fees of 1,770 rupees for all the position has to be paid through the recruitment portal gateway. Documents required to be submitted along with the hard copy of the complete application form. Here the category wise are mentioned in detail. You may check down properly. So these are all the details, instruction and the in detail recruitment notification regarding the assistant professor, associate professor and professor vacancies from the University of Jammu. So in intercity candidates may apply for this position. Thank you.